Chapter 75. The Judicial Inquiry. Nortier was waiting, dressed in black and seated in his chair. When the three people he was expecting to see had entered, he looked at the door, which his valet immediately closed. "Mind what I say," Villefort whispered to Valentine, who could not disguise her joy. "If Monsieur Nortier wants to tell you something that will prevent your marriage, I forbid you to understand him." Valentine blushed but did not reply. Villefort went across to Nortier. "Here is Monsieur Franz d'Épinay," he said. "You asked to see him, monsieur, and he has acceded to your wishes. We have all doubtless wanted this interview to take place for a long time, and I shall be delighted if it proves to you how ill-founded was your opposition to Valentine's marriage." Nortier replied only with a look that turned Villefort's blood to ice. Then the same eyes asked Valentine to come over to him. In a moment, thanks to the means which she usually employed in her conversations with her grandfather, she had found the word key. Then she looked at the invalid, who was staring hard at the drawer in a little table between the two windows. She opened the drawer, and did indeed find a key inside it. Once she had the key, and the old man had shown her that it was the right one, his eyes turned towards an old, long-forgotten writing desk, which everyone assumed to be full of useless papers. "Should I open the writing desk?" Valentine asked. "Yes," the old man indicated. "Should I open the drawers?" "Yes." "The ones at the side?" "No." "The one in the middle?" "Yes." Valentine opened it and took out a bundle. "Is this what you want, grandfather?" she said. "No." She took out all the other papers in turn, until there was absolutely nothing left in the drawer. "It's empty now," she said. Nortier's eyes were fastened on the dictionary. "Yes, Grandpa, I understand," the young woman said, and she repeated each letter of the alphabet one after another. At the letter S, Nortier stopped her. She opened the dictionary and went down to the word secret. "Ah, there's a secret," said Valentine. "Yes," Nortier replied. "Who knows it?" Nortier looked towards the door, through which the servant had just left. "Barrois?" she asked. "Yes," said Nortier. "Should I call him?" "Yes." She went to the door and called Barrois. Meanwhile, Villefort was sweating with impatience, and Franz was struck dumb with astonishment. The old servant appeared. "Barrois," said Valentine, "my grandfather has asked me to take the key out of this console, open the desk and pull out this drawer. Now, there is some secret compartment to this drawer which, it appears, you know. Please open it." Barrois looked at the old man. "Obey," said Nortier's intelligent eye. Barrois did so. A hidden compartment opened and revealed a bundle of papers, tied with a black ribbon. "Is this what you want, monsieur?" Barrois asked. "Yes," said Nortier. "To whom should I give these papers? To Monsieur de Villefort?" "No." "To Mademoiselle Valentine?" "No." "To Monsieur Franz d'Épinay?" "Yes." Franz, in astonishment, took a step backwards. "To me, monsieur?" he asked. "Yes." Barrois handed him the papers, and, looking at the cover, Franz read, "To be entrusted after my death to my friend General Durand, who will himself, when he dies, bequeath this packet to his son, with instructions to keep it, since it contains a document of the greatest importance." "Well then, monsieur," Franz asked, "what would you like me to do with this document?" "To preserve it sealed as it is, no doubt," said the Crown Prosecutor. "No, no," Nortier replied vigorously. "Perhaps you would like the gentleman to read it?" Valentine asked. "Yes," the old man replied. Did you understand, Baron? My grandfather is asking you to read the paper, Valentine said. In that case, let's sit down, Villefort said impatiently. This will take some time. Sit down, said the old man's eye. Villefort did so, but Valentine remained standing beside her father and leaning on the back of his chair, with Franz in front of him. The mysterious piece of paper was in his hand. Read, said the old man's look. Franz unwrapped the envelope, and everything in the room fell silent. In the midst of this he read, Abstract of the proceedings of the session of the Bonapartist Club in the Rue Saint-Jacques, held on February the 5th, 1815. At that, Franz paused and exclaimed, February the 5th, 1815? That is the day on which my father was assassinated. Valentine and Villefort said nothing. Only the old man's eye clearly commanded him to read on. But it was after he left this very club that my father disappeared, Franz said. Noirtier's look still said, Read. Franz continued. We, the undersigned Louis-Jacques Beaurepaire, Lieutenant Colonel in the artillery, Etienne Duchampy, Brigadier, and Claude Le Chapral, Director of Forestry, hereby declare that on February the 4th, 1815, a letter reached us from the island of Elba, recommending to the members of the Bonapartist Club General Flavien de Quesnel, who, having served the Emperor from 1804 to 1815, was worthy of their trust and goodwill, as being entirely devoted to the Napoleonic dynasty, despite the title of Baron with which King Louis XVIII had just endowed on his state of Epinay. A letter was consequently sent to General de Quesnel inviting him to take part in the following day's session, February the 5th. This letter did not inform the general of either the street or the number of the house in which the meeting was to be held, but asked him to be ready for someone to collect him at 9 o'clock in the evening. Meetings were held between 9 and midnight. At 9 o'clock the president of the club called on the general. The latter was ready. The president told him that one condition of his admission was that he should always remain ignorant of the venue for the meeting, and that he should allow his eyes to be bound, swearing that he would not try to raise the blindfold. General de Quesnel accepted this condition and promised on his honour not to try to see where he was to be led. He had asked for his carriage to be prepared, but the president told him that it could not under any circumstances be used, since there was no sense in blindfolding the master if his coachman was to keep his eyes open and recognize the streets through which they drove. What is to be done then? Asked the general. I have my own carriage, said the president. Are you then so sure of your coachman that you would confide in him a secret that you consider unwise to impart to mine? Our coachman belongs to the club, said the president. We are to be driven by a member of the Council of State. In that case, the general said, laughing, we are running a different risk, which is that we shall end in the ditch. We cite this pleasantry as evidence that the general was in no way obliged to take part in the meeting, but attended it of his own free will. Once they had got into the coach, the president reminded the general of his promise to let his eyes be bound. The general made no objection to this formality, and it was carried out with a scarf, left ready for the purpose in the coach. As they were driving, the president thought he observed the general trying to look under his blindfold, and again reminded him of his oath. Of course, said the general. The carriage stopped in a driveway off the Rue Saint-Jacques. The general got down, guided by the hand of the president, without being aware of the latter's eminence. He took him to be a simple member of the club. Crossing the drive, they went up to the first floor of the house and into the council chamber. The meeting had already begun. The members of the club, informed of the person who was to be introduced that evening, were all present. The general was led to the centre of the room and asked to take off his blindfold. He immediately complied, and seemed very astonished at finding so many well-known faces in an organization the very existence of which, until then, he had not even suspected. He was questioned about his loyalties, but contented himself with the answer that the letters from Elba must have made clear. Franz stopped reading. "My father was a royalist," he said. "There was no need to ask him about his loyalties, which were well known." "Hence my own attachment to him," said Villefort. "When two people share the same ideas, my dear Franz, they easily become attached to one another." "Read," the old man said with a look. Franz continued. Here the president requested the general to explain himself more fully, but Monsieur de Quesnel replied that his chief wish was to know what they wanted of him. He was then acquainted with the contents of the letter from the island of Elba, recommending him to the club as a man whose help and cooperation could be counted on. One paragraph dealt at length with the Emperor's probable return from Elba, and promised a further letter with more details on the arrival of the ship Pharaon, belonging to the shipowner Morel of Marseille, whose captain was entirely devoted to the imperial cause. Throughout the time that this was being read, the general, on whom the company had thought they could rely on as a brother, gave on the contrary visible signs of disgust and dissatisfaction. When the letter had been read, he remained silent, with lowered brow. "Well," the president asked, "what do you say to this letter, Monsieur de Général?" "I say that it is a little soon," he replied, "since we gave our oaths to King Louis XVIII, for us to violate them on behalf of the former emperor." This time the reply was too unambiguous for there to be any mistake about his feelings. "General," the president said, "for us there is no present King Louis XVIII any more than there is any former emperor. There is only His Majesty the King and Emperor, who for 10 months has been exiled from France, his state, by violence and treachery." "Excuse me, gentlemen," said the general, "it may be that for you there is no King Louis XVIII, but there is one for me, since it was he who made me baron and brigadier. I shall never forget that I owe these 2 titles to his fortunate return to France." "Monsieur," the president said, in the gravest tones, rising to his feet, "beware of what you are saying. Your words clearly demonstrate that our friends on Elba were mistaken about you, and that they misled us. What you have been told depended on the confidence we had in you, and consequently on a belief that did you honour. Now it appears we were wrong. A title and a military rank have led you to transfer your loyalty to the new government that we wish to overthrow. We shall not oblige you to assist us. We would not enroll anyone against his conscience and his will, but we shall oblige you to behave as a man of honour, even if you should not be inclined to do so." "By man of honour you mean knowing of your conspiracy and not revealing it. I, for my part, should describe this as being your accomplice. You see that I am even more open than you are." "Oh, father," said Franz, pausing, "now I understand why they killed you." Valentine could not help glancing at Franz. The young man was truly handsome in his filial devotion. Villefort was pacing up and down behind him, and Noirtier's eyes searched the face of everyone there, while the man's attitude remained stern and dignified. Franz went back to the manuscript and continued. "Monsieur," the president said, "we asked you to come to this meeting. We did not drag you here by force. When we suggested blindfolding you, you did not demur. By agreeing to these 2 requests, you knew perfectly well that we were not concerned with bolstering up the throne of King Louis XVIII, because in that case we should not have taken so much trouble to hide from the police. Now, you understand, it would be too convenient if one could put on a mask in order to uncover people's secrets, and then simply to take off that mask to destroy those who have trusted in you. No, no, you must first of all say frankly if you support this present fortuitous monarch, or His Majesty the Emperor." "I am a royalist," the general replied. "I have sworn an oath to Louis XVIII, and I shall keep it." At these words a murmur ran round the room, and from the looks exchanged between several members of the club, it was evident that they were debating the question of whether Monsieur d'Épinay should be made to regret these rash words. The president rose once more and called for silence. "Monsieur," he said, "you are too serious and sensible a man not to realize the consequences of the situation in which we stand towards one another. Your very frankness dictates the conditions that we must now impose upon you. You must therefore swear on your honor that you will reveal nothing of what you have heard." The general reached for his sword. "Since you mention honor, then at least start by not ignoring the rules of honor, and do not attempt to impose anything by violence." "And you, monsieur," the president went on, with a calm that was perhaps more awful than the general's anger, "I advise you not to touch your sword." The general looked around him with an expression which betrayed a hint of anxiety. However, he still did not give way, but, on the contrary, summoning up all his strength, he said, "I shall not swear." "In that case, monsieur, you will die," the president replied calmly. Monsieur d'Épinay became very pale. Once more he looked all around him. Several members of the club were muttering and searching for weapons under their cloaks. "Calm yourself, General," the president said. "You are among men of honor who will try every means to persuade you before turning to the last resort. But as you said, you are also among conspirators and in possession of our secret, so you must restore it to us." A highly charged silence followed those words, and since the general did not reply, the president ordered the footman to close the doors. The same deathly silence followed this order. Then the general came forward, and, making a violent effort to control his feelings, said, "I have a son, and I must think of him now that I find myself among murderers." "General," the leader of the assembly said with dignity, "a single man always has the right to insult 50. That is the privilege of weakness. However, he is wrong to exercise that right. Believe me, you would do better to swear and not to abuse us." Once more reduced to silence by the other's moral superiority, the general hesitated for a moment. Then, at last, he walked across to the president's desk and asked, "What is the form of words you require?" "The following. I swear on my honor never to reveal to anyone in the world what I saw and heard on February the 5th, 1815, between 9 and 10 o'clock in the evening, and I declare that I deserve the punishment of death if I should violate this oath." The general appeared to suffer a nervous tremor that for some seconds prevented him from replying. At length, overcoming his obvious reluctance, he did utter the words required of him, but in such a low voice that it could hardly be heard. Several members therefore demanded that he should repeat it more loudly, and this was done. "Now I wish to leave," the general said. "Am I free at last?" The president stood up, nominated 3 members of the group to accompany him, and after blindfolding the general, got into the carriage with him. One of the 3 members was the coachman who had brought them. The other members of the club dispersed in silence. "Where would you like us to take you?" the president asked. "Wherever I can be delivered from your presence," Monsieur d'Épinay answered. "Take care, monsieur," the president warned. "You are no longer in a large company. You are dealing with individuals. Don't insult them unless you wish to take responsibility for your remarks." But instead of taking his meaning, Monsieur d'Épinay replied, "You are still as bold in your carriage as you were in your club, for no other reason, monsieur, than that 4 men are always stronger than 1. The president called on the driver to stop the carriage. They had just arrived at the end of the Quai d'Ombre, where there is a stairway leading down to the river. "Why have you pulled up here?" Monsieur d'Épinay asked. "Because you have insulted a man, monsieur," said the president, "and this man does not want to take a step further without demanding that you make honourable amends." "Here is yet another method of assassination," said the general, shrugging his shoulders. "Silence," the president replied, Unless you wish me to consider you as one of those people you referred to a short while ago, that is to say, a coward who uses his weakness as a shield. You are alone, and one man alone will answer you. You have a sword at your side, and I have one in this cane. You have no second, but one of these gentlemen will serve you. Now, if you are agreeable, you can take off your blindfold." The general at once tore off the handkerchief around his eyes, saying, "At last I shall find out who I am dealing with." The carriage door was opened, and the 4 men got down. Once more Franz paused. He wiped the sweat from his brow. There was something fearful in the sight of this son, pale and trembling, reading aloud these previously unknown details of his father's death. Valentine clasped her hands as if in prayer. Noirtier looked at Villefort with an almost sublime expression of contempt and pride. Franz continued. "As we mentioned, it was February the 5th. For the past 3 days the temperature had fallen to 5 or 6 degrees below freezing. The stairway was coated with ice. The general was tall and fat, so the president offered him the side nearest the rail to go down. The 2 seconds followed behind. The night was dark. The quayside between the stairway and the river was damp with snow and frost, and a few blocks of ice flowed past in the deep black water. One of the seconds went to fetch a lantern from a coal barge, and by the light of it they examined the weapons. The president's sword, which he said was a simple sword stick, was shorter than that of his opponent and had no handguard. General d'Épinay suggested that they should draw lots for the 2 swords, but the president replied that he had provoked the duel, and that by doing so he had implied that each of them should use their own weapon. The seconds tried to persuade him, but the president told them to desist. The lantern was set on the ground. The 2 adversaries stood on either side of it, and the duel began. The light transformed the 2 swords into shafts of lightning, but the men could hardly be seen, so dark was it. The general had the reputation of being one of the best blades in the army, but from the first passes he was harried so hard that he gave ground, and in doing so he fell. The seconds thought he was dead, but his opponent, who knew that he had not hit him, offered his hand to help him back to his feet. This gesture, instead of calming the general, annoyed him, and he threw himself in his turn against his opponent. The latter, however, did not give an inch, blocking him against his sword. 3 times the general retreated, finding he was too hard pressed, then returned to the fray. On the 3rd occasion he fell once more. They thought he had slipped, as before, but since he did not get up, the witnesses went over to him and tried to lift him to his feet. Then the man who had taken hold of his shoulders felt something wet beneath his hands. It was blood. The general, who had more or less lost consciousness, recovered his senses and said, "Ah, they sent me some swordsman, some fencing master from the army." Without replying, the president went over to the second, who was holding the lantern, and, rolling back his sleeve, showed 2 wounds that had pierced his arm, and then, opening his coat and unbuttoning his waistcoat, he pointed to a 3rd wound in his side. Yet he had not uttered a sigh. General d'Épinay was in his death agony. He expired 5 minutes later. Franz read these last words in such a choking voice that they could hardly be heard. After reading them, he stopped, passing his hand across his eyes as if to dispel a cloud. But after a moment's silence, he went on. The president went back up the stairway, after replacing his sword in its stick. A trace of blood in the snow marked his passage. He had not yet reached the top of the stairs when he heard the dull sound of something hitting the water. It was the general's body, which the seconds had just thrown into the river after confirming that it was dead. Consequently, the general died as the result of an honourable duel, and not, as might be supposed, in an ambush. In witness of which we have signed the present account to establish the true facts, so that none of the participants in these terrible events should ever be accused of premeditated murder or of failing to respect the laws of honour. Signed, Beaurepaire, Duchampy, and Le Charpal. When Franz had finished this account, so terrible for a son to read, when Valentine, pale and tense, had wiped away a tear, and when Villefort, trembling in a corner, had tried to avert the storm with a look of entreaty towards the pitiless old man, d'Épinay turned to Noirtier and said, "Monsieur, since you know every detail of this frightful story, since you have had it witnessed by honourable men, and finally since you seem to take an interest in me, even though so far your interest has only been a source of pain, do not deny me one last satisfaction. Tell me the name of the president of the club, so that I may at last know who killed my poor father." Villefort, as though distracted, was groping for the handle of the door. Valentine shrank back a pace. She had guessed the old man's reply before anyone, having often noticed the scars of two sword wounds on his forearm. "In heaven's name, mademoiselle," Franz said, turning to his fiancée, "assist me, so that I may discover the name of the man who made me an orphan at the age of 2. Valentine remained silent and motionless. "Come, monsieur," said Villefort, "take my advice. Do not prolong this frightful scene. In any case, the names were concealed deliberately. Even my father does not know this president, or if he does, he would not be able to tell us. There are no proper names in the dictionary." "Alas, no," said Franz. "The one hope that sustained me throughout the account and gave me the strength to read it to the end was that I should at least learn the name of the man who killed my father. Monsieur," he cried, turning to Noirtier, "in heaven's name, do what you can. I beg you, try to show me, to let me know—" "Yes," said Noirtier. "Ah, mademoiselle," said Franz, "your grandfather indicated that he can tell me the man's name. Help me, you understand him. Give us your aid." Noirtier looked towards the dictionary. Franz picked it up with a nervous shudder and said the letters of the alphabet until he reached M. Here the old man signalled yes. "M," Franz repeated. The young man's finger ran down the words, but at every one Noirtier replied in the negative. Valentine's head was buried in her hands. At last Franz reached the word myself. "Yes," the old man said. "You?" Franz cried, his hair raising on his head. "You, Monsieur Noirtier? Did you kill my father?" "Yes," Noirtier replied, fixing the young man with an imperious look. Franz's feet could no longer support him, and he slumped into a chair. Villefort opened the door and fled, for he had just had an impulse to stifle the last dregs of life still remaining in the old man's fearsome heart. Chapter 76. The Progress of the Younger Cavalcanti. During this time, Monsieur Cavalcanti the elder had left to resume his post, not in the army of His Majesty the Emperor of Austria, but at the roulette tables of Bagni di Lucca, where he was one of the most loyal courtiers. It goes without saying that he had taken with him the amount allocated for his journey, and as a reward for the solemn and dignified way in which he had played his role of father, scrupulously counted down to the last paul. On his departure, Monsieur Andrea had inherited all the papers affirming that he had the honour to be the son of the Marquis Bartolomeo and the Marchioness Leonora Corsinari. He was thus more or less established in Parisian society, which is so open to receiving strangers and treating them not as what they are, but as what they wish to be. In any case, what is required of a young man in Paris? To speak the language, more or less, to be acceptably turned out, to be a good sport, and to pay cash. It goes without saying that still more indulgence is shown to foreigners than to Parisians. As a consequence, within a fortnight Andrea had acquired a reasonably good standing. He was addressed as Monsieur le Comte. It was said that he had an income of 50,000 livres, and there were rumours of an immense fortune belonging to his noble father, which was allegedly buried in the quarry at Saravezza. This last detail was stated as a fact in the presence of a scientist who announced that he had seen that very quarry. This added a great deal of weight to statements that had until then been dubious and insubstantial, but henceforth took on the solidity of fact. This was the state of things in that portion of Parisian society to which we have introduced our readers when, one evening, Monte Cristo went to visit Monsieur Danglars. Danglars himself was out, but the Count was invited to visit the Baroness, who was at liberty to receive guests, and he accepted. Since the dinner at Auteuil and the subsequent events, Madame Danglars could not hear Monte Cristo's name without a sort of nervous twitch. If the mention of his name was not followed by the Count's physical presence, this painful sensation intensified. On the other hand, if the Count appeared, his open features, his shining eyes, his friendliness and his gallantry towards Madame Danglars very rapidly dispelled all traces of anxiety. It seemed to the Baroness impossible that a man so charming in appearance could have any evil designs against her. In any case, even the most corrupt of us finds it hard to believe in evil unless it is based on some interest. We reject the idea of harm done for no cause and without gain as anomalous. When Monte Cristo entered the boudoir into which we have already introduced our readers, and where the Baroness was casting an anxious eye over drawings handed to her by her daughter after she had looked at them with the younger Cavalcanti, the Count's presence produced its usual effect, and the Baroness received him with a smile, though she had been somewhat troubled at the sound of his name. He took in the whole scene at a glance. Beside the Baroness, Eugénie was sitting, almost recumbent on a sofa, with Cavalcanti standing. He was dressed in black like a hero from Goethe, with highly polished shoes and white silk stockings, running a white, well-manicured hand through his blonde hair, in the midst of which could be seen the flicker of a diamond. Despite Monte Cristo's advice, the vain young man had not been able to resist slipping this stone onto his little finger. The hand movement was accompanied by provocative glances at Mademoiselle Danglars, and sighs dispatched in the same direction as the glances. Mademoiselle Danglars was still the same, that is to say, beautiful, cold, and contemptuous. Not a single glance or sigh from Andrea escaped her, but they appeared to be deflected by the breastplate of Minerva, which philosophers sometimes say in fact covered the breast of Sappho. Eugénie greeted the Count coldly, and took advantage of the earliest opportunity in the conversation to take herself off to her study, whence two voices could shortly be heard, merry and boisterous, accompanied by the first chords on a piano, informing Monte Cristo that Mademoiselle Danglars had just preferred the company of Mademoiselle Louise d'Armilly, her singing instructor, to his own and that of Monsieur Cavalcanti. Most of all, even as he was talking to Madame Danglars and appeared entirely absorbed in the conversation, the Count noticed Monsieur Andrea Cavalcanti. His anxiety, his way of going over to the door to listen to the music without daring to go through it, his way of expressing his admiration. Shortly afterwards the banker himself came in. His first look was towards Monte Cristo, the second towards Andrea. As for his wife, he greeted her as certain husbands do greet their wives, a thing that bachelors will be able to imagine only when someone has done a very profound analysis of the conventions of married life. "Haven't those young ladies invited you to make music with them?" Danglars asked Andrea. "Alas, no, monsieur. Andrea replied, with an even more perceptible sigh than the earlier ones. Danglars at once went across to the door between the two rooms and opened it, to reveal the two young women sitting on the same piano seat in front of the same piano. Each was playing the part for one hand, an exercise that they had practised to amuse themselves, and at which they had become remarkably proficient. Framed in this way by the door, Mademoiselle d'Armilly could now be seen with Eugénie forming one of those tableaux vivants which are often exhibited in Germany. She was of quite exceptional beauty, or rather of exquisite sweetness. She was a small woman, as slender and blonde as a fairy, with eyes heavy with tiredness, and long hair falling in ringlets across an excessively long neck, of the sort that Perugino sometimes gives to his virgins. It was said that she had a weak chest, and that, like Antonia in the Violon de Crémone, she would one day die singing. Monte Cristo took in this female group in a single rapid searching glance. It was the first time he had seen Mademoiselle d'Armilly, though he had often heard her mentioned in this house. "Well, then," the banker said to his daughter, "are you trying to keep us out?" And he yet led the young man into the small drawing-room. Whether by chance or intentionally, the door was pushed to behind Andrea, so that from where they were sitting, neither Monte Cristo nor the Baroness could see anything. But as the banker had followed Andrea, Madame Danglars did not appear to notice this fact. Shortly afterwards the Count heard Andrea's voice harmonizing with the sound of the piano which accompanied a Corsican song. As he listened to this with a smile, forgetting Andrea and recalling Benedetto, Madame Danglars was boasting to Monte Cristo of her husband's strength of character, since that very morning he had again lost 300,000 or 400,000 francs in a Milanese bankruptcy. Indeed, the praise was well merited. If the Count had not known of it through the Baroness, or perhaps through one of those means he had of knowing everything, the Baron's face would have told him nothing. Good, Monte Cristo thought. He is already at the stage where he is concealing his losses. A month ago he was boasting of them. Then aloud he said, "Oh, madame, Monsieur Danglars knows the exchange so well that he is sure to regain there what he loses elsewhere." "I see that you share a common misconception," said Madame Danglars. "What is that?" asked Monte Cristo. "That Monsieur Danglars gambles on the stock exchange, when, in fact, on the contrary, he never does any such thing." "Ah, of course not. I recall now that Monsieur Debray told me. By the way, madame, what has become of Monsieur Debray? I have not seen him for 3 or 4 days." "Nor have I," said Madame Danglars with astonishing self-control. "But you began to say something." "What was that?" "That Monsieur Debray, you said, told you—" "Ah, that's right. Monsieur Debray told me that you were the one who is addicted to gambling on the exchange." "I did have a taste for it, I admit," said Madame Danglars, "for a while, but no longer." "Then you are wrong, madame. Heavens! Chance is so uncertain a thing that if I were a woman and fate had made me the wife of a banker, however much faith I had had in my husband's good luck, because, as you know, everything in speculation depends on good or bad luck, however much I say I were to trust in my husband's good luck, I should make certain of acquiring some independent means, even if to do so I had to entrust my interests to a stranger." Madame Danglars blushed, despite herself. "Now, for example," said Monte Cristo, as if he had noticed nothing, "people are speaking of a splendid killing that was made yesterday on Neapolitan bonds." "I don't have any of those," the Baroness interjected, "and I never did. But that's enough of the exchange now, Monsieur le Comte. We must sound like a couple of stockbrokers. What about the poor Villeforts, who are having such bad luck at present?" "What has happened to them?" Monte Cristo asked, quite innocently. "But you know very well. After losing Monsieur de Saint-Marin 3 or 4 days after his departure, they have just lost the Marchioness 3 or 4 days after her arrival." Oh, so they have, I did hear that. But, as Claudius says to Hamlet, such is the law of nature. They lost their fathers and mourned them. They will die before their sons, who will mourn them in turn. But that's not all. How do you mean, that's not all? No. You know they were going to marry their daughter to Monsieur Franz d'Epinay. Has the marriage fallen through? Yesterday morning, apparently. Franz released them from their obligations. Really? Does anyone know the reason for this upset? No. Good Lord. What are you telling me, madame? And how is Monsieur de Villefort facing up to all this misfortune? Philosophically, as always. At that moment Danglars returned, alone. Well, said the Baroness, have you left Monsieur Cavalcanti with your daughter? What about Mademoiselle d'Armilly? The banker said. Doesn't she count? Then he turned to Monte Cristo. A charming young man, don't you think, Monsieur le Comte, this Prince Cavalcanti? The only question is he really a prince? I can't guarantee it, Monte Cristo said. His father was introduced to me as a marquis. He could be a count, but I think that he doesn't even make any great claim to the title himself. Why not? Said the banker. If he is a prince, he is wrong not to boast of it. Every man has his rights. Personally, I don't like those who renounce their origins. You are a perfect democrat, Monte Cristo said with a smile. Just consider the risk you are taking, said the Baroness. If Monsieur de Morcerf were to come here by chance, he would find Monsieur Cavalcanti in a room where he, Eugenia's fiancé, has never been permitted to enter. You are right to say by chance, said the banker, because in truth we see him so rarely that one could indeed say that he comes by chance. Well, no matter. If he were to come and find this young man with your daughter, he might be displeased. He? Ha! You are mistaken. Monsieur Albert does not do us the honour of being jealous of his fiancée. He doesn't love her enough for that. In any case, what do I care if he is displeased or not? Even so, at the stage we have reached. Yes, at the stage we have reached. Shall I tell you what stage we have reached? The stage is that The stage is that at his mother's ball he only danced with my daughter once, while Monsieur Cavalcanti danced with her 3 times, and Albert didn't even notice. Viscount Albert de Morcerf, the footman announced. The Baroness leapt to her feet. She was about to go through to the little drawing-room to warn her daughter, but Danglars put his hand on her arm. "Leave it," he said. She looked at him in astonishment. Monte Cristo pretended not to have seen this little piece of stage business. Albert came in, very handsome and very pleased with life. He greeted the Baroness in an easy manner, Danglars in a familiar one, and Monte Cristo with affection. Then, turning to the Baroness, he asked, May I be permitted to inquire after the health of Mademoiselle Danglars?" "Excellent, monsieur," Danglars replied sharply. "At the moment she is music-making in her private study with Monsieur Cavalcanti." Albert preserved his air of calm indifference. He may perhaps have felt some inner annoyance, but he felt Monte Cristo's eyes on him. "Monsieur Cavalcanti has a very fine tenor voice," he said, "and Mademoiselle Eugenie a superb soprano, not to mention the fact that she plays the piano like Thalberg. It must be a delightful concert." "The fact is," Danglars said, "that they harmonize wonderfully well together." Blatant though it was, Albert pretended not to have noticed the ambiguity in this remark, but Madame Danglars blushed. "I am a musician myself," the young man went on, "or at least so my teachers say. So it's an odd thing, but I have never yet been able to make my voice harmonize with any other, and with soprano voices least of all." Danglars gave a little smile that meant, "But why aren't you annoyed?" And, doubtless hoping to achieve his goal, he said, "Which is why the prince and my daughter were universally admired yesterday. Weren't you there yesterday, Monsieur de Morcerf?" "Oh, what prince is that?" Albert asked. "Prince Cavalcanti," Danglars said, still persisting in giving the young man this title. "Oh, I beg your pardon," said Albert. "I was not aware that he was a prince. So, Prince Cavalcanti sang with Mademoiselle Eugénie yesterday? Oh, it must have been truly delightful to hear, and I am very sorry to have missed it. I could not accept your invitation. I had to accompany Madame de Morcerf to the Baroness de Château-Renard, the mother, that is, where the Germans were singing." Then, after a short pause, he added quite casually, "Might I be allowed to present my respects to Mademoiselle Danglars?" "Oh, wait, I beg you," said the banker, putting a hand on his arm. "Can't you hear what an exquisite cavatina? Charming! Just a moment and they will have finished. Perfect! Bravo! Bravi! Brava!" Danglars launched into a frenetic round of applause. "Truly delightful," said Albert. "No one could understand the music of his country better than Prince Cavalcanti. You did say prince, didn't you? In any case, even if he isn't a prince, he can be made one. It's easy in Italy. But to come back to our delightful songsters, you should do something for us, Monsieur Danglars. Without telling them that there is a stranger here, you should ask Mademoiselle Danglars and Monsieur Cavalcanti to begin another piece. It is such an exquisite pleasure to enjoy music from a distance in the shadows, without seeing or being seen, and so without embarrassing the musician, who can thus abandon himself or herself to all the impulses of genius and the transports of the heart." This time the young man's sang-froid even left Danglars speechless. He drew Monte Cristo aside. "Well, I never. What do you think of our lover?" he asked him. "I have to admit he does seem a trifle cold, but what can you do? He's committed. Oh, you're committed." "Certainly. I'm committed to give my daughter to a man who loves her, not to one who doesn't. Just look at him, cold as marble, arrogant like his father. If only he were rich, if he had a fortune like the Cavalcantis, then one might overlook it. As yet I have not spoken to my daughter, but if she has any taste—" "Oh, come," said Monte Cristo. "I may be blinded by my friendship for him, but I assure you that Monsieur de Morcerf is a delightful young man, who will make your daughter happy, and eventually make something of himself. After all, his father moves in the highest circles." Danglars said. "Why these reservations?" "There is still his past, shrouded in obscurity." "But the father's past does not affect the son." No, indeed. Come now, don't be carried away. A month ago you thought it was a splendid match. You understand, I'm deeply mortified. It was at my house that you met young Cavalcanti, and, as I told you, I do not know him." "I do," said Danglars. "That's all I need." "You know him? Have you made inquiries into his background?" asked Monte Cristo. "Do I need to? Can't you tell what kind of a man he is just by looking at him? To start with, he's rich." "I can't swear to it." "But you're standing surety for him even so?" "For 50,000 livres, a mere trifle." "He is well educated." It was Monte Cristo's turn to say, "He's a musician?" "Just like all Italians." "Come now, Count, you are not fair to the young man." "Well, no, I confess I am sorry to see that, knowing your arrangement with the Morcerfs, he should interfere with it in this way and take advantage of his wealth." Danglars began to laugh. "What a Puritan you are," he said. "It happens every day in society." "But, my dear Monsieur Danglars, you cannot just break it off like that. The Morcerfs are counting on the match." "They're counting on it?" "Absolutely." "Then let them explain what's going on. You should have a word about this with the father, my dear Count, since you are such a good friend of the family." "Me? What on earth made you think that?" "Their ball, I think. I mean to say the Countess, the proud Mercedes, the haughty Catalan who barely deigns to open her mouth to her oldest acquaintances, took your arm and went out into the garden with you, led you off to the far corner, and only reappeared half an hour later." "Please, Baron, please," said Albert. "We can't hear a thing. What an outrage from a music lover like yourself, too." "Oh, yes, very witty, young Mr. Sarcasm," he said, then turning back to Monte Cristo. "Would you be good enough to say that to the father?" "Certainly, if you wish." "And this time let's have it all done clearly and definitely. He can ask me for my daughter's hand, set a date, talk about the dowry. In short, let's shake hands on it or shake fists, but no more delays, you understand." "Very well, I'll talk to him for you. I'm not saying that I await the outcome with pleasure, but I shall expect to hear from him. As you know, a banker is bound by his word." And he gave one of those sighs that had been heard from the younger Cavalcanti half an hour earlier. "Bravi! Bravo! Brava!" Morcerf yelled, applauding the end of the piece in parody of the banker. Danglars was starting to bristle at this when a footman came and whispered in his ear. "I'll be back shortly," he said to Monte Cristo. "Wait for me. I may have something to tell you before you leave." And he went out. The Baroness took advantage of her husband's absence to throw open the door to her daughter's study, and they saw Monsieur Andrea, who had been seated at the piano with Mademoiselle Eugénie, leap to his feet as if powered by a spring. Albert smiled and bowed to Mademoiselle Danglars, who did not appear in the slightest embarrassed, but returned her usual cold curtsy. Cavalcanti, on the other hand, did show signs of evident embarrassment. He greeted Morcerf, who returned the greeting with a look of the utmost impertinence, then started to pour out a torrent of praise for Mademoiselle Danglars' voice, saying how much he regretted not having been able to attend the previous evening's soirée, having heard an account of it. Cavalcanti, left to himself, took Monte Cristo aside. "Now then," said Madame Danglars, "that's enough music and compliments. Let's take a cup of tea." "Come on, Louise," Mademoiselle Danglars said to her friend, and they all went into the drawing-room next door, where tea was indeed waiting. Just as they were beginning, in the English manner, to leave their spoons in their cups, the door opened and Danglars reappeared, evidently very upset. Monte Cristo particularly noticed it, and gave the banker an inquiring look. "I have just received my dispatches from Greece," he said. "Oh?" said the Count. "Is that why you were called away?" "Yes." "And how is King Otto keeping?" Albert asked, in his jolliest tone of voice. Danglars looked askance at him without replying, and Monte Cristo turned away to hide a look of pity that had appeared on his face, and which almost immediately vanished. "We shall leave together, shan't we?" Albert asked the Count. "Yes, if you wish," he replied. Albert could not understand anything in the expression on the banker's face, so, turning to Monte Cristo, who understood perfectly well, he said, "Did you see how he looked at me?" "Yes," said the Count. "Did you find something odd in this look?" "I certainly did. But what is all this about news from Greece?" "How should I know?" "Because I assume you have spies in the country." Monte Cristo smiled, as one does when one has no intention of replying. "Look, he's just coming over to you. I'm going to compliment Mademoiselle Danglars on the cameo she is wearing. Meanwhile, the father will have the time to tell you all about it." "If you do compliment her, let it be for her voice at least," said Monte Cristo. "Not at all. Anyone could do that." "My dear Viscount, you have the conceit of impertinence," Monte Cristo said. Albert crossed over to Eugénie with a smile on his lips. Meanwhile, Danglars bent over the Count's ear. "You gave me excellent advice," he said, "and there is a frightful story behind those two words, Fernand and Janina." "No, really?" said Monte Cristo. "Yes, I'll tell you about it, but take the young man away. For the moment I should be too embarrassed to stay in the room with him." "That's just what I'm going to do. He's coming with me. And do you still want me to send the father to you?" "More than ever." "Very well." The Count signalled to Albert. Both of them said goodbye to the ladies and left, Albert treating Mademoiselle Danglars' scorn with utter indifference, Monte Cristo repeating to Madame Danglars his advice on the wisdom for a banker's wife of ensuring her future. Monsieur Cavalcanti remained master of the field.
And that's the end of the first half, and where we shall take a break. So, do what you're going to do. Get up, wander around, have a stretch, cycle those fluids and whatnot, and we'll see you back here in about 5 minutes or so. Bye for now. welcome back. I hope that was a good and fulfilling break for you. I literally just sat here for 5 minutes looking at things on the internet. Because, you know, gotta be reckless and waste your time sometimes. But yeah, I guess I've got nothing much more to say. So might as well just get straight into the second half of this, which I have queued up and ready. So yeah, enjoy the further continuation of the adventures of the Count of Monte Cristo. I will see you on the other side.
Chapter 77. Heidi. Hardly had the Count's horses rounded the corner of the boulevard than Albert turned to him and burst out into a peal of laughter, a little too loud not to be slightly forced. "Well now," he said, "I might ask you, as King Charles IX asked Catherine de Medici after the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, how do you think I played my little part?" "In what connection?" asked Monte Cristo. "Why, in connection with setting up my rival with Monsieur Danglars." "What rival?" "What rival? Your protégé, Monsieur Andrea Cavalcanti, of course." "You must be joking, Viscount. I do not in any way protect Monsieur Andrea, at least not where Monsieur Danglars is concerned." "That's a criticism I should make of you, should the young man need protection, but luckily for me he doesn't." "Why, do you think he's courting?" "I guarantee it. He rolls his eyes and groans like a lover. He aspires to the hand of the proud Eugenie." "That's a perfect anapaestic line. I promise you it was unintentional. No matter, I'll repeat it. He aspires to the hand of the proud Eugenie." "What matter, since you are the only suitor under consideration?" "Oh, don't say that, my dear Count. I'm spurned from both sides." "How do you mean, from both sides?" "Of course, Mademoiselle Eugenie hardly spoke to me, and her confidante, Mademoiselle d'Armilly, not at all." "Yes, but the father adores you," said Monte Cristo. "Really? On the contrary, he thrust 1,000 daggers into my heart. Admittedly, they were stage daggers with disappearing blades, but he thought they were real enough." "Jealousy implies affection." "Yes, but I am not jealous." "However, he is." "Of whom? Of Debray?" "No, of you." "Me? I guarantee that in a week he will have barred his door to me." "You are wrong, Viscount." "Prove it." "Do you want me to?" "Yes." "I have been asked to request Monsieur de Morcerf to make some definite proposal to the Baron." "Who asked you?" "The Baron himself." "Oh, now," Albert said in the most wheedling tone he could summon, "you wouldn't do that, would you, my dear Count?" "That's where you're wrong, Albert. I have promised, and I shall do it." "Well, then," Albert said with a sigh, "it appears you are determined to see me married." "I am determined to stay on the right side of everyone. But speaking of Debray, I haven't seen him recently at the Baron's." "There has been a disagreement." "With Madame?" "With Monsieur." "Did he notice something going on?" "That's a good one." "Do you really think he suspected?" Monte Cristo asked with charming innocence. "Did he indeed? Where do you come from, my dear Count?" "The Congo, if you wish." "Still not far enough." "What do I know about your Parisian husbands?" "Husbands, my dear Count, are the same everywhere. Once you have seen one specimen in a given country, you know the whole breed." "So what can have come between Danglars and Debray? They seem to get on so well," Monte Cristo said, still feigning innocence. "Now, there we are talking about one of the mysteries of Isis, and I am not an initiate. When the young Cavalcanti is part of a family, you can ask him that." The carriage halted. "Here we are," said Monte Cristo. It is only 10:30. Why don't you come up?" "I should like to." "My carriage can take you home." "Oh, thank you, but I think my coupe will have followed us." "Ah, yes, here it is," said Monte Cristo, jumping down. Both men entered the house where the drawing-room was already lit. "Make us some tea, Baptistin," Monte Cristo said. Baptistin went out without a sound. 2 seconds later he reappeared with a plate already laid, which, like a meal in one of those magical entertainments, seemed to have risen out of the ground. "I must admit, my dear Count," Morcerf said, "that what I admire in you is not your wealth, because there may be people richer than you are. It is not your wit, because although Beaumarchais was not greater, it was as great. But it is your way of obtaining service, without any answering back, to the minute, no, to the second, as if your people had guessed from the manner of your ring just what you wanted, and as if what you wanted was always ready waiting." "There is some truth in what you say. They know my habits. For example, isn't there something you would like to do while you are drinking your tea?" "Why, yes, I should like to smoke." Monte Cristo went over to the bell-push and sounded it once. A second later, a concealed door opened and Ali appeared with 2 chibouks, already filled with excellent latakia. "Extraordinary!" No, elementary, my dear Morcerf," said Monte Cristo. "Ali knows that, when I take tea or coffee, I usually smoke. He knows that I have called for tea and that I came back with you. He hears me ring for him, guesses the reason, and since he is a native of a country where hospitality is expressed chiefly around the pipe, he brings 2 chibouks instead of 1. "Agreed, that is as good an explanation as any other, but the fact remains that only you— Ah, what's that I hear?" And Morcerf bent his head towards the door, through which wafted sounds that were similar to those of a guitar. "There, my dear Viscount, you are condemned to have music this evening. No sooner have you escaped from Mademoiselle Danglars' piano than you are entrapped by Haydée's guzla." "Haydée, what a delightful name! Are there really women called Haydée outside the poems of Lord Byron?" "Indeed there are. Haydée may be a rare name in France, but it is common enough in Albania and Epirus. It is as though you were to say chastity, modesty, or innocence. It is a kind of baptismal name, as you Parisians call them." "That's utterly charming," said Albert. "How I should love to see our Frenchwomen called Mademoiselle Silence, Miss Goodness, or Miss Christian Charity. Just suppose that Mademoiselle Danglars, instead of being called Claire Marie Eugénie, as she is, was named Miss Chastity, Modesty, Innocence Danglars. Damn it! Think how that would sound when they published the banns." "Idiot," the Count said. "Don't joke so loudly. Haydée might hear you." "Would it upset her?" "Not at all," the Count replied haughtily. "Good-natured, is she?" Albert asked. "It has nothing to do with goodness, but with duty. A slave does not get upset with her master." Come, don't joke yourself. Are there still slaves?" "Of course, since Haydée is mine." I must say you do nothing and possess nothing as other people do. Slave to Monsieur de Comte de Monte Cristo, that's a rank in France. The way you shift gold, it must be worth 100,000 écus a year." 100,000 écus? The poor girl used to own more than that. She came into the world with a fortune besides which those in 1,001 nights are a trifle. She must truly be a princess, then. As you say, and moreover one of the greatest in her country. I thought as much, but how did a great princess become a slave? How did Denise the tyrant become a schoolmaster? The fortunes of war, my dear Viscount, and the whims of fate. Is her name a secret? For everyone else it is, but for you, dear Viscount, since you are a friend and know how to keep quiet, don't you, if I ask you not to tell anyone? Oh, on my honour! Do you know the story of the Pasha of Janina? Ali Tebelin? Certainly, since it was in his service that my father made his fortune. Oh, of course it was, I had forgotten. So what is Hedi to Ali Tepelin? Quite simply, his daughter. What? The daughter of Ali Pasha? And the beautiful Vasikili. And now she is your slave? She most certainly is. How did it happen? Why, one day when I was strolling through the market in Constantinople, I bought her. Magnificent! One does not live with you, dear Count, one dreams. Now, listen, but I'm going to be very presumptuous. Tell me anyway. Since you go out with her and take her to the opera... What then? Could I be bold enough as to ask this of you? Be bold enough to ask me whatever you wish. Well then, Count, will you introduce me to your princess? Certainly, on 2 conditions. I accept without hearing them. The first is that you never tell anyone that you have met her. Very well. Morcerf held out his hand. I swear. The second is that you will not tell her that your father served hers. Oh, I swear that too. Excellent, Viscount. You will remember these 2 oaths, won't you? Please, said Albert. Very well. I know you are a man of honour. The Count rang the bell again, and Ali reappeared. Tell Hedi, the Count said, that I shall be taking coffee in her room, and inform her that I should like her to permit me to introduce her to one of my friends. Ali bowed and went out. Are we agreed then, Viscount? No direct questions. If you wish to know something, ask me, and I shall ask her. That's agreed. Ali reappeared for a 3rd time, and kept the door open to indicate to his master and Albert that they could go through. Come in, said Monte Cristo. Albert ran a hand through his hair and curled his moustache, while the Count took his hat, put on his gloves, and preceded his guest into the apartment that was guarded by Ali like an advanced sentry and protected by the 3 French maids under Myrto. Hedi was waiting in the first room, the drawing-room, her eyes wide with astonishment. This was the first time that any man other than Monte Cristo had come into her quarters. She was seated on a sofa in the corner of the room, her legs crossed under her, having built, as it were, a nest for herself in the richest striped and embroidered materials of the East. Near her was the instrument, the sound of which had betrayed her presence. It was a delightful picture. When she saw Monte Cristo, she raised herself up with a smile that was at once that of a daughter and a lover, unique to herself. Monte Cristo went over and offered his hand, to which, as usual, she pressed her lips. Albert had stayed by the door, enraptured by this strange beauty, impossible to imagine in France, which he was seeing for the first time. "Whom have you brought me?" the young woman asked Monte Cristo in Romaic. "A brother, a friend, a mere acquaintance, or an enemy?" "A friend," Monte Cristo replied in the same language. "Called?" "Count Albert. He is the one I rescued from the bandits in Rome." "In what language would you like me to address him?" Monte Cristo turned to Albert. "Do you know modern Greek?" he asked. "Alas, no," said Albert, "not even ancient Greek, my dear Count. Never have Homer and Plato had such a poor, I might even say such a disdainful student as I was." "In that case," Hedi said, showing that she had understood Monte Cristo's question and Albert's reply, "I shall speak French or Italian, if my master wishes me to speak, of course." Monte Cristo thought for a moment. "Speak Italian," he said. Then, turning to Albert, "It's a pity you don't understand either modern or ancient Greek, both of which Hedi speaks exceptionally well. The poor child will have to talk to you in Italian, and this may give you a wrong idea of her." And he motioned to Hedi. "Welcome, friend, since you come with my lord and master," the young woman said in excellent Tuscan, with that gentle Roman accent that gives the language of Dante a richer sound than of Homer. "Ali, bring us coffee and pipes." She gestured to Albert to come over, while Ali left to carry out his young mistress's orders. Monte Cristo showed Albert 2 folding stools, and each of them went to take one and draw it up to a kind of pedestal table with a hookah as its centrepiece, surrounded by natural flowers, drawings, and albums of music. Ali returned, bringing the coffee and the chibouks. As for Monsieur Baptistin, this part of the house was off limits to him. Albert declined the pipe that the Nubian offered him. "Take it, do," said Monte Cristo. "Haydée is almost as civilized as a Parisian woman. She dislikes Havana tobacco because she is not fond of foul odours, but Oriental tobacco, as you know, is a perfume." Ali went out. The cups of coffee were standing ready with, for Albert, a bowl of sugar. Monte Cristo and Haydée took their mocha in the Arabic manner, that is, unsweetened. Haydée reached out and took the Japanese porcelain cup in the tips of her long pink fingers, raising it to her lips with the innocent pleasure of a child drinking or eating something that she likes. At the same time, 2 women came in, carrying more trays, laden with ices and sorbets, which they set down on 2 small tables, waiting there especially for that purpose. "My dear host," said Albert in Italian, "and you, signora, forgive my astonishment. I am naturally amazed. Here in the heart of Paris I find the Orient, the true Orient, not unfortunately as I have experienced it, but as I have dreamed it. And only a moment ago I could hear the sound of a passing omnibus and the lemonade sellers ringing their bells. Oh, signora, if only I could understand Greek. Your conversation in these enchanted surroundings would make this an evening that I would always remember." "I speak Italian well enough to converse with you, monsieur," Haydée said calmly. "I shall do my best, if you like the East, to help you discover it here." "What can I talk about?" Albert whispered to Monte Cristo. "Whatever you wish. About her country, her childhood, her memories. Then, if you prefer, about Rome, Naples, or Florence." "Oh, no," Albert said. "There is no point in meeting a Greek if one is merely going to talk to her about all the things one would discuss with a Parisienne. Let me ask her about the East." "Go on then, my dear Albert. She likes nothing better than to talk of that." Albert turned to Haydée. "At what age did the signora leave Greece?" he asked. "At the age of 5, Haydée replied. "And do you recollect your homeland?" Albert asked. "When I close my eyes, I can again see everything that I used to see. There are 2 ways of seeing, one with the body and with the soul. The body's sight can sometimes forget, but the soul remembers forever." "What is your earliest memory?" "I could hardly walk. My mother, who is called Vasiliki, in Greek, Vasiliki means royal," the young woman added, tossing back her head. "My mother took my hand, and both covered in a veil, after putting all the gold we had into the bottom of a purse, we went to beg for alms for prisoners, saying, 'He that hath pity upon the poor lendeth unto the Lord.' Then, when the purse was full, we went back to the palace, and saying nothing to my father, we sent all the money that people had given us, thinking we were poor women, to the Huguemenos of the monastery, who divided it among the prisoners." "How old were you at that time?" 3. "So you can remember everything that happened around you since the time when you were 3? "Everything." "Count," Morcerf whispered to Monte Cristo, "please allow the signora to tell us something about her history. You forbade me to talk to her about my father, but perhaps she would say something about him, and you cannot imagine how happy I should be to hear his name on such lovely lips." Monte Cristo turned to Haydée, and, furrowing his brow in a way that warned her to pay the closest attention to what he was about to tell her, said in Greek, "Tell us your father's fate, but not the traitor's name or his treachery." Haydée gave a deep sigh, and a dark cloud passed across her pure brow. "What did you tell her?" Morcerf asked under his breath. I repeated that you are a friend and that she has no cause to hide anything from you. So, Albert went on, this distant pilgrimage on behalf of the prisoners was your first memory. What is the next? The next? I see myself in the shade of some sycamore trees, near a lake whose shimmering reflection I still glimpse between the branches. My father was sitting on cushions against the oldest and most leafy of them, and my mother lying at his feet, while I, a weak child, am playing with the white beard that falls upon his chest, and the cangiar with the diamond hilt that hung in his belt. Then, from time to time, an Albanian would come to him and say a few words, which I ignored, and he would reply without any alteration in his voice, either kill or spare. It's strange, Albert said, to hear such things from the lips of a young woman, other than in the theatre, and to tell oneself this is not an invention. With such a poetic horizon, such a wondrous past, how do you find France? I think that it is a beautiful country, Hades said, but I see France as it is, because I see it with the eyes of a grown woman, while I have only ever seen my own country with the eyes of a child, so that it seems to me always enwrapped in a mist that is either luminous or dark, depending on whether my eyes perceive it as a sweet homeland or a place of bitter suffering. How can someone as young as you, Signora, have known suffering? Albert asked, succumbing despite himself to the force of banality. Haidee turned to Monte Cristo, who, with a barely perceptible gesture, murmured, "Speak." More than anything else, it is one's first memories that furnish the depths of the soul, and apart from the two that I have just told you, all my childhood memories are sad. I beg you to continue, Signora, said Albert. I assure you that I am quite enchanted to listen to you. Haidee smiled sadly. Would you like me to recall my other memories? She said. Please do, said Albert. I was 4 years old when, one evening, I was woken by my mother. We were in the palace at Janina. She lifted me off the cushions where I was laying, and when I opened my eyes, I saw that hers were full of large tears. She took me away, saying nothing. But when I saw her cry, I started to do the same. Silence, child, she said. Often, capricious like all children, I would carry on crying despite my mother's consolation or her threats, but this time there was such a note of terror in her voice that I instantly fell silent. She hurried away with me. I saw that we were going down a wide staircase. In front of us, all my mother's maidservants were going, or rather rushing down the same staircase, carrying boxes, bags, ornaments, jewels, and purses of gold. Behind them came a guard of 20 men, armed with long rifles and pistols, dressed in a costume that has become familiar to you in France since Greece regained its nationhood. I assure you, Haidee said, shaking her head and paling at the mere memory, there was something sinister in this long procession of slaves and women half drugged with sleep. Or so I thought at least, perhaps believing that others were sleeping because I was only partly awake myself. Gigantic shapes hurried down the stairway, their shadows cast on the ceiling by pine torches. "Hurry!" cried a voice at the end of the gallery. At the sound, every head was bent, as the wind blowing over the plains bends a field of corn. But I shuddered to hear it, because it was the voice of my father. He was walking behind us all, dressed in his finest attire, holding a carbine that your emperor gave him, and his free hand resting on his favourite, Selim, he drove us before him like a shepherd with a frightened flock. My father, Haidee said, looking up, was an illustrious man, known in Europe as Ali Tebelin, Pasha of Janina, who made the Turks tremble before him. Without knowing why, Albert shuddered on hearing these words spoken in tones of such pride and dignity. It seemed to him that something dark and fearful shone from the young woman's eyes when, like a pythoness calling up a ghost, she reawoke the memory of this blood-stained figure whose awful death made him loom gigantic in the eyes of modern Europe. Shortly afterwards, Haydée continued, the procession halted. We were at the foot of the steps on the edge of a lake. My mother pressed me to her beating breast, and 2 paces behind us I saw my father, who was casting anxious glances to all sides. In front of us were 4 marble steps, with a boat bobbing at the last of them. From where we were, we could see a black shape in the middle of the lake. This was the pavilion for which we were heading. Perhaps because of the darkness, it seemed a long way away to me. We stepped down into the boat. I remember that the oars made no noise as they touched the water. I looked over the side at them. They were wrapped in the belts of our palicares. In the boat, apart from the oarsmen, there were only some women, my father, my mother, Selim, and I. The palicares had stayed at the edge of the lake, kneeling on the bottom step and using the other 3 as a rampart in case they had been followed. Our boat was flying like the wind. "Why is the boat going so fast?" I asked my mother. "Hush, child," she said, "we are fleeing." I could not understand. Why was my father fleeing? My father, the all-powerful, before whom others normally would flee. My father whose motto was, "They hate me and that is why they fear me." Yet he was indeed fleeing across the lake. He has since told me that the garrison of the castle at Janina, tired of long service. Here Haydée turned meaningfully towards Monte Cristo, whose eyes did not leave hers. Consequently, she continued slowly, like someone inventing or disguising the details of the story. "You were saying, Signora," Albert said, paying close attention to her account, "that the garrison at Janina, tired of long service, had negotiated with a Serakisa Kachid, who was sent by the Sultan to kidnap my father. At this, my father decided to retire into a hiding place that he had long kept prepared for himself, called Kataphygion, which means refuge, after sending the Sultan a Frankish officer in whom he trusted utterly." "Do you remember the name of this officer, Signora?" Albert asked. Unseen by Morcerf, Monte Cristo exchanged a look with the young woman. "No," she said, "I cannot remember it, but I may do so later, and then I shall tell you." Albert was about to mention his father's name when Monte Cristo quietly raised his finger to call for his silence. The young man remembered his vow and said nothing. We were rowing towards this pavilion. It had a ground floor with arabesque ornamentation and a first floor overlooking the lake. As far as could be seen, that was all. But beneath the ground floor was an underground passage extending beneath the island, a vast cavern into which I, my mother, and her women were led. Here, piled into a single heap, were 60,000 purses and 200 barrels. In the purses were 25 million in gold coin, and in the barrels 30,000 pounds of powder. Selim, the favourite of my father's whom I mentioned, was standing by the barrels. He would watch day and night, holding a stave at the end of which was a burning wick. He had orders to blow everything up, the pavilion, the guards, the pasha, the women, and the gold, at the slightest sign from my father. I remember that our slaves, knowing they were in such fearful company, spent their days and nights in praying, weeping and moaning. As for myself, I can still see the young soldier with his pale skin and black eyes. When the angel of death comes down to take me, I am certain I shall recognize Selim. I cannot say how long we remained thus. In those days I did not know what time was. At intervals, though rarely, my father had us brought up to the terrace of the palace. These were moments of delight for me, since there was nothing to look at underground except the groaning figures in the darkness and Selim's burning stave. Sitting in front of a large opening, my father would look grimly towards the depths of the horizon, studying every black dot that appeared on the lake, while my mother, half sitting, half lying beside him, rested her head on his shoulder, and I played at his feet. With that wonder of childhood which magnifies things, I would admire the escarpments of Pinde looming on the horizon, the castles of Janina, rising white and angular from the blue waters of the lake, and the huge tufts of black foliage clinging like lichens to the mountainside, which from afar looked like tufts of moss, and from close to are tall fir trees and immense myrtle bushes. One morning my father sent for us. We found him quite calm, but paler than usual. "Be patient, Vasikili, for today all will be over. Today the master's firman arrives, and my fate will be sealed. If there is a complete pardon, we shall return in triumph to Janina. If the news is bad, we shall flee tonight." "But suppose they do not let us flee," said my mother. "Have no fear on that score," Ali answered, smiling. "Selim and his burning stave guarantee that. They might wish me dead, but not if it is a matter of dying with me." These words of consolation did not come from my father's heart, and my mother answered them only with sighs. She prepared the iced water that he continually drank, because from the moment when he retired into the pavilion he had been seized with a burning fever. She perfumed his white beard and lit the chibuk, the smoke of which, as it curled into the air, he would watch abstractedly, sometimes for hours on end. Then, suddenly, he made a brusque movement which startled me. Without taking his eyes away from what had attracted his attention, he asked for his telescope. My mother gave it to him, whiter than the balustrade against which she was leaning. I saw my father's hand shake. 1 boat, 2, 3, he murmured, 4, and he got to his feet, grasped his weapons, and, I remember, emptied some powder into the pan of his pistols. "Vasikili," he told my mother with a visible shudder, "this is the moment that will decide our fate. In half an hour we shall know the response of the sublime emperor. Return underground with Hedi." "I do not wish to leave you," Vasikili said. "If you die, my master, I want to die with you." "Go to Selim," my father cried. "Farewell, my lord," my mother muttered obediently, bent double as if by the approach of death. "Take Vasikili," my father told his palikares, but I was forgotten. I ran to him and reached out my hands. He saw me and, leaning over, pressed his lips to my forehead. Oh, that kiss! It was the last, and it is still on my brow. On the way down, through the vines on the terrace, we saw the boats getting larger as they approached across the lake. At first they had been merely black dots. Now they were already like birds skimming across the surface of the waters. Meanwhile, in the pavilion, 20 palikares, seated at my father's feet and hidden by the wooden panelling, were watching the arrival of these boats with angry eyes, their long guns, encrusted with silver and mother-of-pearl, held at the ready. A large number of cartridges were spread around the floor. My father looked at his watch and walked anxiously back and forth. This is the scene that I saw as I left my father, taking with me the last kiss that I ever received from him. My mother and I went down the underground passage. Selim was still at his post. He smiled at us sadly. We went to search for cushions on the other side of the cavern and came to sit close to him. In times of great danger, loyal hearts seek one another, and though I was only a child, I felt instinctively that a great misfortune was hovering above our heads. Albert had often heard tell of the last moments of the vizier of Janina, not from his father, who never spoke of it, but from strangers. He had also read different accounts of the man's death, but this story, brought to life in the person and the voice of this young woman, these living tones and this mournful elegy, struck him with both an inexpressible charm and an inexpressible feeling of horror. As for Haidee, she had paused for a moment, caught up in her dreadful memories. Her head, like a flower bending on a stormy day, had fallen forward onto her hand, and her eyes, lost in the distance, still seemed to see the green slopes of Pinde on the horizon and the blue waters of the lake of Janina, a magic mirror reflecting the dark scene that she had described. Monte Cristo was looking at her with an indefinable look of concentration and pity. "Carry on," he said to her in Romaic. Haidee looked up, as though Monte Cristo's sonorous voice had woken her from a dream, and continued her story. It was 4 o'clock in the evening, but even though it was a pure and brilliant day outside, we were plunged in the darkness of the underground tunnel. A single light was burning in the cave, like a star trembling against a black sky. This was Selim's taper. My mother was a Christian, and she was praying, while from time to time Selim repeated the hallowed formula, "God is great." Even now my mother retained some hope. As she came down, she thought she recognized the Frank who had been sent to Constantinople, and in whom my father had every confidence, knowing that the soldiers of the French Sultan are usually noble and generous. She took a few steps towards the staircase and listened. "They are coming," she said. "Let us pray that they are bringing peace and life." "What are you so afraid of, Vasikili?" Selim replied, in a voice that was at once so soft and so proud. "If they do not bring peace, we shall give them death." And he stirred the embers with his lance, in a gesture like that of an antique Cretan Dionysus. But, being an innocent child, I was afraid of his courage, which seemed to me savage and senseless, and I shrank from the terrible death that flared up in the air and the flames. My mother experienced the same fear, because I felt her shudder. My God, Mother," I cried, "are we going to die?" When they heard this, the cries and lamentations of the slaves redoubled. "Child," Vasikili said, "pray God that you may not come to desire the death that you fear so much now." Then, under her breath, she said, "Selim, what are the master's orders?" "If he sends me his dagger, then the Sultan refuses him mercy and I must light the fire. If he sends me his ring, then the Sultan has pardoned him and I hand over the powder store." "Friend," my mother said, "when the master's order comes, if it is the dagger that he sends, instead of you subjecting us to that death which so terrifies us both, we shall offer you our throats, and you can kill us with the dagger." "Yes, Vasikili," Selim answered calmly. Suddenly we heard loud cries. We listened. They were cries of joy. The name of the Frank who had been sent to Constantinople echoed backwards and forwards between our palicares. It was clear that he had brought the reply of the sublime emperor, and that the reply was favourable. "You don't remember his name?" Morcerf asked, ready to prod the storyteller's memory. Monte Cristo made a sign to her. "No, I don't remember," said Haidee. The noise increased. Footsteps approached. Someone was coming down the steps into the underground shelter. Selim prepared his lance. Shortly afterwards, a shape appeared in the bluish half-light of the sun's rays which penetrated right down to the door of the cavern. "Who are you?" Selim asked. "Whoever you are, do not take another step." "Glory to the Sultan," the shape said. "A full pardon has been granted to the Vizier Ali. Not only is his life spared, but his fortune and his possessions are returned to him." My mother gave a cry of joy and pressed me to her heart. "Stop," Selim said to her, seeing that she was already preparing to run out. "You know that I need the ring." "That is true," my mother said, falling to her knees and raising me towards the heavens, as if, since she was praying to God on my behalf, she actually wanted to lift me towards him. Once more Haidee paused, overcome with such emotion that the sweat ran down her pale brow and her strangled voice seemed unable to emerge from her dry throat. Monte Cristo poured a little iced water into a glass and gave it to her, saying, "Be strong," in a gentle voice beneath which there was the hint of an order. Haidee wiped her eyes and forehead and went on. Meanwhile, our eyes, getting used to the dark, had recognized the Pasha's envoy. He was a friend. Selim had recognized him, but the noble young man knew only one thing: how to obey. "In whose name do you come?" he asked. "In the name of our master Ali Tebelin." "If you come in Ali's name, do you know what to give me?" "Yes," said the envoy. "I bring you this ring." And as he said this, he held his hand above his head. But he was too far away, and from where we were standing it was not light enough for Selim to distinguish what he was holding up and recognize it. "I cannot see what you are holding," said Selim. "Then come over here," said the messenger, "or I shall come over to you." "Neither," the young soldier replied. "Put whatever you are showing me down on the spot where you are, under that ray of light, and go away until I have examined it." "Very well," said the messenger, and he retired after putting down the token in the place where he had been told. Our hearts were beating fast. The object did indeed appear to be a ring, but was it my father's? Selim, still holding his burning torch, went over to the doorway, bent down beneath the ray of light and picked up the token. "The master's ring," he said, kissing it. "All is well." Then he turned the torch earthwards and extinguished it with his feet. The messenger gave a cry of joy and clapped his hands. At the signal, 4 soldiers of Serakizier Kurchid dashed forward, and Selim fell beneath the wounds of 5 daggers, each man having smitten him with his own. Yet, drunk with their crime, though still pale with fear, they rushed into the cavern, searching everywhere for any sign of fire and rolling among the sacks of gold. Meanwhile, my mother seized me in her arms, and, nimbly hurrying through meandering passages that only we knew, she came to a concealed staircase up to the pavilion, where the most frightful tumult reigned. The lower rooms were entirely occupied by Kurchid's tocadors, that is, by our enemies. At the moment when my mother was about to push open the little door, we heard the Pasha's voice, terrible and threatening. My mother pressed her eye to an opening in the wall, and it happened that there was another gap at my own eye level, so I also looked. "What do you want?" my father was saying to some men holding a sheet of paper with gold lettering on it. "What do we want? We want to inform you of His Highness's wishes. Do you see this firman?" "I do," said my father. "Read it then, it calls for your head." My father gave a shout of laughter more terrifying than any threat. It had not ended before 2 pistol shots erupted from each of the pistols in his hands, and he had killed 2 men. At this, the Palikares, who were all lying all around my father, face down on the floor, leapt to their feet and began firing. The room filled with noise, flames and smoke. At the same moment, firing began from the other side, and shots whistled through the wooden planks all around us. Oh, how handsome he was, and how great he was, my father, the Vizier Ali Tebelin, in the midst of this gunfire, his scimitar in his hand and his face black with gunpowder. How his enemies fled before him. "Selim, Selim," he cried, "keeper of the fire, do your duty." "Selim is dead," replied a voice which seemed to come from the depths of the pavilion. "And you, my lord Ali, you are lost." At the same time there was a dull thud, and the floor burst into pieces around my father's feet. The chocadors were firing upwards through it. 3 or 4 palicares fell, rent from head to foot by wounds that traversed their whole bodies. My father roared, plunged his fingers into the bullet holes, and pulled up an entire floorboard. But at that moment, through the hole he had made, 20 shots rang out, and a sheet of flame, rising as though from the crater of a volcano, lit the hangings and devoured them. In the midst of all this dreadful noise, in the midst of all these fearful cries, 2 shots rang clearer than any of the rest, and 2 cries more heartrending than any around them. The 2 shots had delivered a mortal wound to my father, and it was he who had cried out. Yet still he remained standing, clasping onto a window frame. My mother beat on the door, wanting to enter and die with him, but the door was locked from the inside. Around him the palicares were writhing in their death throes. 2 or 3 who were unharmed or only lightly wounded dived out of the windows. At the same time, the whole floor cracked open, shattered from below. My father fell to one knee, and as he did so, 20 arms reached up. Holding sabres, pistols, and daggers, 20 blows struck that one man simultaneously, and my father vanished in a maelstrom of fire, fanned into life by these roaring demons, as if hell itself had opened beneath his feet. I felt myself pulled to the ground. My mother had fainted. Haydée let fall her arms, groaning and looking at the Count as though to ask if he was satisfied with her obedience. He got up, came across to her, took her hand and said to her in Romaic, "Rest, my dear child, and console yourself with the thought that there is a God to punish traitors." "This was a dreadful story, Count," Albert said, alarmed at Haydée's pallor. I reproach myself now for having been so indiscreet." "You have no need to," Monte Cristo replied. Then, putting his hand on her head, he continued, "Haydée is a brave woman, and she has sometimes found relief in describing her misfortunes." "Because, my lord," the young woman exclaimed, "the tale of my sufferings reminds me of your goodness towards me." Albert looked at her curiously. She had not yet told him what he most wanted to know, how she had become the Count's slave. Haydée saw the same wish in his eyes and the Count's, so she went on. "When my mother came to herself, we were both in front of the Séraquisière. 'Kill me,' my mother said, 'but spare the honour of Ali's widow.' 'It is not I with whom you should plead,' said Kerchid. 'With whom, then?' 'With your new master.' 'And who is that?' Kerchid showed us one of the men who had most contributed to my father's death,' the young woman said, with brooding anger. 'So, did you become this man's property?' Albert said. 'No,' Haydée replied. 'He did not dare keep us, but sold us to some slave dealers on their way to Constantinople. We crossed through Greece and were almost dead on arriving at the imperial gate, which was crowded with onlookers who stepped aside to let us pass, when suddenly my mother follows their eyes, cries out, and falls to the ground, showing me a head impaled above the gate. Beneath it were the words, 'This is the head of Ali Tebelin, Pasha of Janina.' Weeping, I tried to raise my mother to her feet, but she was dead. I was taken to the bazaar. A rich Armenian bought me, educated me, gave me teachers, and, when I was 13, sold me to Sultan Mahmud." "And from him," Monte Cristo said, "I bought her, as I told you, Albert, for that stone equal to the one in which I keep my lozenges of hashish." "Oh, my lord, how good and great you are," said Haydée, kissing Monte Cristo's hand. "How fortunate I am to belong to you." Albert was dumbstruck at what he had heard. "Finish your coffee," the Count said to him. "The story is over."